A judge recently ruled that Texas may not be able to keep out lab-generated meat, even if the state decided that it doesn't align with its food system and it's not best for the residents of the state. The ruling really wasn't about food, it's about whether or not a state can say no. And it raises a much bigger question. Who actually gets to decide what food shows up on your plate? So let's talk about what lab-generated meat actually is and why this decision matters far beyond the boundaries of Texas. Lab-generated meat is not widely available yet, which means very few people have eaten it. That also means that we don't have any long-term human health data to make any decisions with. So the real issue here is how fast this technology is being pushed into the food system and who gets to decide whether or not you can avoid it. Well, a federal judge recently ruled that states like Texas may not be allowed to keep lab-generated meat out. And that's even if the state chooses to protect agriculture independence and try to protect the consumers and give the citizens transparency in their food choices, which is what most consumers want. This is even looking at the fact that we don't have any long-term data that really tells us anything about this as a food source. So this isn't about whether lab-generated meat is good or bad per se. It's about whether forcing a technology into the food system is looking at, it's really trying to push it in before you understand what the risk associated with it is. And that's doing this at the expense of being able to limit the public's ability to opt out, to demand disclosure, to want to know what's in their food or where it originated or came from, and to ultimately allow them to be able to make an informed decision about what they're eating. When food origin becomes unclear, when processing methods are obscure, they're not transparent, when frankly innovation and technology starts to mean more and outpace physiology, there's some health consequences that can be real concerns. And when we look at scenarios like this that have happened in the past where technology was put forth first, we see that these health consequences may not show up immediately, but they do show up. So in this video is all about how food technology gets fast-tracked, why that food matters to the entire body, and why outcomes are likely going to be health damaging. And this is not about ideology, politics, or fear. This is just simply looking at systems, biology, and what the choice of the consumer is. Now, before we get going too far here, let me introduce myself. I'm Dr. Arland Hill. I'm both a clinician and a rancher. So you can see why this story is important to me, but also I see both sides here. I'm looking at the physiology and the food. And guys, every day I'm out in my pastures, I'm observing cattle, I'm looking at how nature has established this ability to produce these life-sustaining meats, and it really makes me wonder what logical reason is there for trying to produce and push this alternative method into the environment, into the food supply. And what concerns me here is not really innovation. I'm not an anti-innovation individual. It's what kind of precedents are we setting based on this judge's ruling and what that's going to mean for the consumer long term. Let's talk about what lab-generated meat actually is. It's animal cells that are grown in controlled environments. And we don't need to get into all the problems that could be or that could arise from where the animal cells are coming from, how that can get consolidated and really start to create numerous constraints on the food supply. That's a whole other conversation. But note that these animal cells, they require a growth media, they require some type of scaffolding to grow on to create structure for this meat product, and they require processing to try to resemble meat rather than just being meat. So this is not What we're talking about here is not a whole food plant protein. It's definitely not traditional animal agriculture. It's a novel ultra engineered food category. And novelty, just to be fair, doesn't automatically mean bad, but novelty also does not mean that it's automatically proven safe either, and that it should be fast-tracked in to the food supply. And if you look at this lab-generated meat conversation and you compare it against other historical analogies, for example, glyphosate herbicides, trans fats in the diet, in the food supply, ultra-processed seed oils, artificial sweeteners, we all know how those have all turned out as well, and they all began with the same mindset of innovation, trying to do what's better for the consumer, and it didn't end up turning out that way. Let's talk about why this ruling in Texas matters, even if you're not in Texas. And understand that this is not about label disputes. That's not primarily why this is playing out. It's not about whether lab-generated meat is safe or unsafe. This is all about whether a state can say no to a novel food technology. This ruling is opening the door for companies to argue that state-level resistance to lab-generated meat is an infringement on their right to sell, right? So the companies are being infringed upon is how this is being positioned. That flips this from the default thought process, which is that you need to prove that this is safe before there's market access. And that just seems logical for pretty much all of us, but that's not what these companies are arguing for, and it's not what this judge has kicked the door open for them to try to impose on the consumer. There's a lack of proof of why this shouldn't be allowed, right? So it's just a completely different argument that's being posed. We need proof of, is this food safe or is this food not safe? And then we can talk about whether or not it should be introduced into the marketplace, as opposed to whether or not a company is being infringed upon, whether or not they can sell a product. Well, what about the consumer? Are you misleading the consumer and infringing on the consumer's health, right? So there's the other side of this. Here's why this is also just bigger than Texas. If states cannot opt out of these foods being sold in their states, markets cannot choose exclusion. Like, you can't say that I don't want something that is a known problem or a suspected health food problem being introduced into my state. It takes away the ability of states to enforce that. And ultimately, consumers are going to lose a layer of protection when that happens. It's creating, on the opposite, forced exposure. There's no optional adaptation or adoption, if you will, and the better way of saying that. There's no optional adoption of whether or not we want that food in your state. And you're saying that the people, it's okay if individuals are harmed. Again, I'm basing this off what the track record of these technologies being introduced into the food supply has been. You're not saying to people that they may lose their ability to choose avoidance. You're just telling them that they're not going to be able to avoid these foods because they're going to be part of the food supply. Now, there is also a historical precedent that you have to acknowledge here, which is, let me use Roundup as the example on this because it fits very nicely here. When you see that these food technologies have been fast-tracked in, they've previously been framed up as progress, but they're doing this before any long-term health data exist. And when glyphosate was first introduced, Roundup, if you will, when that was first introduced, it wasn't introduced as being harmful. Nobody talked about that. It was all about the benefits and nothing to do about the risk. There was the concerns that are associated with the widespread exposure. All that emerged later on down the road. That wasn't brought forth up front, whether or not it was known or not, and we suspect now that it was. That seems to have been now disclosed at this point. But it emphasizes the pattern. The pattern here is what I want you to see. And the pattern is that when there's adoption, it you're seeing that adoption gets normalized and the delayed consequences don't get brought forth, and you're restricting the choice of the consumer, especially now that there's a track record on introducing these technologies. You're telling the consumer, no, you are going to be exposed to this in your supermarkets, in your restaurants, because no doubt these will come in at a cheaper price point. And by doing that, they're going to acknowledge those facets as well and try to position it as it's so much better of an option, when in reality, again, if it's following this track record, that's not going to play out. And you have to also, when you're looking at this conversation, ask yourself, who's pushing this narrative for lab-generated meat? It's certainly not farmers and ranchers, and it's not the researchers and clinicians that are independent and fair-minded. It's the lab-grown meat companies that are backed by what I would call money at the expense of health. That's the mentality that they're using. It's all about the bottom line on this. And frankly, these individuals that are doing this, that are producing this lab-generated meat and that are really behind this, these aren't the folks that are out there that are getting their hands dirty at the farms and the ranches, right? These are the guys that are sitting behind desks, pushing pins and making decisions. They don't understand what real food is. Now, this article where I got a lot of this information from is written by Sid Miller. Sid Miller is the Texas Ag Commissioner. And he made a statement that probably says it best. And again, guys, in other videos, I've been very critical of Sid Miller. I'm not a fanboy for Sid Miller by any means, but I give credit where credit's due. And he made a comment here that I think is very just to the point on this. And he said, lab-grown meat is not progress, it's a Trojan horse. And that is exactly what it is. It is selling you a bill of goods for something that it is not, and that it can't be. And that's just what it is. And now, if we take all of this information that I've shared with you and tied it back to health, and you look at the fact that we don't yet have any information on long-term health effects, and if you look at that from a medicine, from a healthcare perspective, novelty generally requires caution. We see that caution when you think about a lot of times bringing a medication, and medications have to go through trials. And say what you will about trials, whether there's false information in there at times and all that. Yeah, I get that, right? But there's still a pump the brakes mentality that has to get played out on some of these. And yes, there have been exceptions with past incidents. I get that, right? It's not the point of the debate here. There's also, when you look at this, there's the absence of this data and making the assumption that that's going to create safety. Where else does that exist in healthcare? It doesn't. So why is this all of a sudden being allowed to be acceptable when it comes to introducing lab-grown meat? There's also the loss of transparency. And you're taking away informed consent, you're taking away what I would consider as clinical interpretation of how that meat is actually going to support an individual, because we don't really have any information on that food product like we do with other foods. You're limiting the consumer's choice, and you're dictating to them often really in many cases, what they can eat. I just think you're giving a false narrative around this whole conversation. So here's my core takeaways for you on this, okay? This video wasn't meant to be about fear. It's really about your permission as the consumer. If you don't want lab-generated meat in the food system, guys, you don't have to argue about that, right? You don't have to do that. You don't have to wait for somebody to regulate lab-generated meat in or out of the conversation. You can take a more direct stance, and you can do that by just simply opting out. You can opt out of the system altogether. And you do that by buying direct from a farm or ranch. Choose protein systems where you can see, you can ask, you can interact, you can develop trust. That's what you should be seeking out as a consumer. It bypasses any type of forced adoption. It's going to preserve food transparency for you, and it's ultimately going to support regional food reliance, where you're not relying on these big consolidated entities that are going to have ultimate control of your food availability. And it's also going to send a very clear signal that this is not the direct adoption for that you as the consumer are not going to be forced into direct adoption. You're the consumer. You get to dictate what you want. So the most effective vote that you can have is not outrage. It's opting out. If this conversation has made you think differently about where your food guidance is coming from, there's another piece you should watch next. In RFK's Food Pyramid, A Clinician and Rancher Responds, I'll walk you through how food policy, nutrition guidance, and real-world health intersect all together. This is not a reaction video, it's a framework for understanding why these conversations keep coming up.